Hello, and thank you for joining today. Before we get started with our guest Marieke today, I will quickly introduce myself and ELU. My name is Lara. I am the community manager at European Leadership University. This means that, for example, I speak to our prospective students, our applicants, but also I manage different partnerships with educational and employer corporate partners in the Netherlands. This is a series specifically towards those of you who are dreaming of a career in data science, but may not know which exact role is right for you, or are looking for some tips from those who are already in the industry on the best way to enter this field and this career path. So I'm very excited that today I am joined by Marieke Vink. Marieke, thank you, of course, for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks.
And Marieke, she is a data science product manager at bol.com. For those of you who are not familiar with bol.com, it is the biggest web store in the Netherlands. I would say the leading e-commerce platform. And previously also Marieke had experience in the e-commerce and also telco sector with Marktplaats and KPN. Of course, this is a bit of a different role than just a data scientist. And today we will definitely learn exactly what a data science product manager does day to day, and also what kind of profile might consider a role like this one, including some of the skills that you need for this type of job. If you have any questions, we will be going through this conversation as a sort of interview. I have some questions prepared for Marieke, but we also would love to hear your questions. So you can drop your questions either in the Q&A or the chat down below in your Zoom controls. And then at the end of the call, we'll also take some time to go over a few questions. So please don't be shy. And without further ado, Marieke, thank you again and welcome. And my first question to you is for those of us with perhaps less tech knowledge or not familiar with this position, what is a data science product manager?
So it's a product manager for a team that is very heavy on data science. So product managers in general are people that help a multidisciplinary development team to develop the product in such a way that it is most helpful to your customers. And in my role particularly, I work with a very data science heavy team. So I'm currently the product manager for the recommendations team at bol.com. But we have similar roles that work with, for example, forecasting. You can imagine that in logistics, we have a lot of forecasting going on. And for example, also in teams that are tasked with finding out what the best possible offer for a particular product could be. Because we have multiple sellers. So you have bol.com itself as a web store, but we also are a platform. So anywhere where we have a very data science heavy team, the product manager is also expected to know about data science and how to use data science in developing a better product.
So as I understand, you know a lot about data science, but you're not a data scientist yourself per se.
I wouldn't dare call myself a data scientist. I did train in analytics. So my background, way back when, I once studied chemistry. This is when data science wasn't really a thing. And after that, I realized that I like the theoretical science and I like working with loads of data. But I wasn't too keen on being in a laboratory. So I ended up in analytics, more of the data analytics type role. And I suppose I would have been a type of data scientist in my role at KPN, but it was more towards marketing intelligence. So I have some experience also training models, but I'm familiar with some of the techniques, but like you wouldn't want me to train a deep learning model at the moment. I know what it could do and how it might be used in production, but I'm not too familiar with the exact workings. I see a question, more of an analytics translator, and I think that's exactly the type of role that I have. So I think this was a role coined by, what are they called, McKinsey, a couple of years ago. And I think indeed the product manager, in particular product management within data science, is a analytics translator role. So my role is to make sure that the engineers, the data scientists, work on the most effective product development things. But my role is also to make sure that the rest of bol.com understands why we make the choices that we do and how and why we make certain prioritization.
So it sounds like you work most heavily with the data science team at bol.com, of course, but you also do work with different teams or translate that from the data science team to other teams. So what does it actually a regular workday look like for you?
It varies, thankfully, but usually there's at least some interaction with the team itself. So our team consists of, I think the official roles are 2 data scientists, 2 machine learning engineers, a data engineer and a software engineer. And that is the team. So these are the people that actually build the recommendations at Bol. And I typically spend at least an hour and probably a stand-up with some of the people in the team or with the entire team. But I also meet up with lots of my stakeholders. So you can imagine within Bol, there's 100 what we call IT teams, and they can be data science teams, don't have to be, they can also be pure software engineering. And in order to get something live to the site or to the app, generally you need at least a couple of these teams to work together on a certain topic. So I spend a lot of time also in alignment with POs from other teams or PMs, but also with the business side of bol.com. So you can imagine that there's people from the different shops within Bol that want something from particular recommendations, but also that maybe there's a kind of Bol-wide priority that we want to do more on, and typically either analysts or managers or business development will contact me and ask what we can do from a recommendations perspective.
And could you tell us a little bit what it is like to work specifically at bol.com, like the company culture or the office culture?
Sure. So Bol is very big by now. So I think there's about 1,800 people, if not 2,000, and keeps growing like crazy. But in a way, it also still feels small. So it's the general population. I think I'm one of the older people there. I'm 41 years old now. I think the average age is about 33. So it's a very, very young company. And what really stood out to me when I joined bol.com May last year, is that there's a lot of room for entrepreneurial spirit. So if you have a very good idea and you talk to the right people, then it's very easy to get your idea to production. So it's people are very eager to help, and there's lots of room for discussion and coming up with good new ideas to help customers.
Yeah, and especially important, of course, in your team. Yeah. So I'd like to talk a bit more about also your journey to your role today. How did you become a data science product manager? Because I imagine that you weren't like maybe young or as a kid thinking, oh, this is what I would like to be when I grow up.
No. I think I wanted to be a violin player. But no, so I started out studying chemistry. But like I said, but I enjoy the theoretical parts, but not so much the practical part. And it was I would kind of by accident I came across a temporary job at KPN, and then a friend of mine that had a very similar background. He studied physics, but didn't really want to be a physicist. He landed a job as a database marketeer, and I remember him going, you would really enjoy this as well. It's working with data, etc. And I remember him sending me the vacancy and me going, I don't even understand what this says. It was talking about campaigns and database selections and SQL and whatnot. But I did decide to apply, and I was hired based on analytical capabilities, which of course, coming from chemistry, were slightly different than the analytical capabilities that we usually mean when we talk about using data. but I learned quick enough. And from there, I ended up in a marketing intelligence academy that KPN was doing together with a company that's now called My Company, MI Company. And so I ended up being a marketing intelligence analyst. And from there, I grew in seniority, also went to a different part of KPN where I wasn't working so much on optimizing marketing, but more on reducing the number of complaints. So figuring out what was like analyzing the customer support flow and seeing where we could improve stuff. And from there, I went to Marktplaats. So Marktplaats, for those of you that don't know Marktplaats is the Dutch classified site. It's part of eBay. And it's one of the bigger online players in the Netherlands. And there I started out as an analyst, but quite quickly that turned into leading an analyst team. And after doing that for a couple of years, I wanted to be closer to the actual development of the site. And I started setting up a data science team. With the difference being between the analysts, so both analysts and data scientists would use data science, but the data scientists were tasked to really put things into production. So making sure that the data was also used on the site to improve the site basically. Yeah, and from there on, I still was kind of indirectly putting stuff to production because I had to work via the data scientist in my team, and I really wanted to work with the team directly. So that's why I ended up at bol.com.
So I think today, there's a lot of talk about data science. It's the hottest job of the century. It's very sexy, but it's also a huge field, right? And that could include a role like yours. So for what type of people could you recommend that perhaps a data scientist might not be the right role for them, but they would rather be suited for a data science product manager role like yours? What type of profile is that?
So I think my role is slightly more generic, and it's also you have to be really excited about working with a lot of people, and also so being good at and enjoying things like stakeholder management, like gathering a lot of ideas, then prioritizing which ones to go for. That's what I enjoy doing. So I enjoy talking to very different disciplines and trying to make them all work together in order to create a better site or a better app. So yeah, I guess you need to enjoy stakeholder management, prioritization, and also doing a lot of sales of why you're making certain choices and why certain things are the best way to go.
And I think you already spoke also about being very strong in analytics, at the same time in translating, educating different teams, different people in the organization as well. So what are the skill sets, that both the hard skills and the soft skills that a data science product manager needs?
So I think hard skills, you need to know a little bit about software engineering and the type of methodologies that they use, but you don't need to be an engineer. And the same thing goes for data science. So you need to understand the rough process of gathering the data, cleaning data, preparing it, training a model, scoring models, and then putting them into production. But you don't need to be able to do it yourself. But you do need to be able to understand why some things are extremely difficult and some things are relatively easy, and what the problem is when certain things are missing or don't work as they should. In soft skills, I think being able to translate between different points of view is one of the best skills to have. So being able to align the view of for example, the user experience analyst and a data scientist on working together to come up with something that supports both their expertises. That's kind of the I think the main soft skill that you need.
And you also said you have set up and led a data science data team.
Yeah.
With that experience, I'm sure you also kind of maybe recruited or interviewed some of the younger members in your team. So what advice would you give to someone who's just starting and entering this field?
I think the main advice would be, and this was a few years back, so maybe this has changed, but I noticed that very often the education that people get at the moment is very focused towards creating the best possible model, which is very interesting from an academic perspective, but it's like getting something to work in production in an online setting is very, very different from that, and it needs much, much more. So familiarizing yourself with the entire process of how do you create pipelines that actually work in production? What do you need? What do you need for that? And what kind of practical restrictions does that put on the type of model that you're choosing? That would be a tip, basically, because that's something that I noticed that generally came with experience and not so much with training.
And here I would also like to bring in a second question from the audience. I imagine that you've worked with a number of different data professionals, including in those data teams that you've built. What is the difference between a data scientist, a data engineer, and a machine learning engineer?
I think there's no strict boundaries. They're more of there's kind of a scale from on the one hand like a hardcore backend software engineer, and on the other hand you end up in maybe even something like qualitative research. But along the way there's people that are good at different things. And if you look at the team that we have, for example, the data scientists, they're really focused on finding the best model to use on the data that we have, knowing how to, what the pre-processing should be doing in order to get to the best possible outcome. The machine learning engineers are tasked with making sure that that also works at huge scale. So Bol.com at the moment sells over 23 million products. And you can imagine that we also have different offers for that. So it's making understanding enough of the modeling to know what it takes to do that at massive scale. The data engineer is very much tasked with making sure that all of the pipelining works as it should. So knowing very well how to drive. I always think this sounds very boring, but it's especially at our scale, this is massively important. The pipelining to make sure that the data is processed somewhat quickly. And ends up in the right way, in the right format, in order to be able to run the type of model that we want, is super important. I see machine learning engineer, scale-up engineer. I think it's not the only thing they should know. It's basically knowing how to put something into production. So not just training a model and making sure that it delivers valuable output, but also making sure that it actually is able to run in production and also run on a scheduled basis, and keeps also has some measure of either improving itself or at least making sure that it doesn't deteriorate over time. So I think it's more than the engineering challenge of scale. It's also having a good knowledge of why particular models need particular type of engineering.
And I
hope that answers it.
Thank you so much. And I think from what you've told me about your role, it seems like you're kind of this unmissable part of the organization, because you're translating between the different teams as well, and helping people to understand what, for me, for example, would be quite hard to understand. So how would you describe your impact on the business, on Bol?
well, no one is unmissable, I think, ever. But from having my role in place, it takes away the kind of the burden of doing the sales pitches and the prioritization from the team itself. So we do make most of the prioritization decisions as a team, but it's up to me to make sure that that I align with the rest of bol.com, and also make sure that whatever new ideas that could be valuable to us live without, like in the outside of the team, I can also bring in. So I'm really kind of a translator between the internal team and the rest of bol.com.
Mm-hmm. And do you also see, especially in organizations that have a similar size or are larger, do you often see this role, or do you also see an effort to maybe develop the kind of soft skills or the translating skills of the tech professionals, the data scientists themselves?
Sure. So I think these moves are possible either way. So I've seen data scientists turn product manager. The other way around is usually harder, because the hard skills are well, at some point you have a achterstand. But I also see many people moving to this type of role, and usually they do have some kind of background in either analytics, data science, or business analytics type roles.
Yeah. And as you're translating from the data science team to the other team, do you also feel like you have to translate from the kind of external organization to the data science team, so vice versa?
Sometimes. So there's so I spend a lot of time explaining why particular models are easy or not easy to implement to business people. But also the other way around, sometimes you find that business value doesn't necessarily translate directly to whatever target you would put in a model. So we have a lot of discussions on, so what should a particular model train for example, and how do we make sure that that actually translates to what we also consider online value. So it's for example relatively easy to train a model to yield the highest possible CTR, but that doesn't necessarily mean that is that reflects what people find most interesting. So having that type of discussion with multiple people and multiple disciplines is useful.
So we'll soon be wrapping up, and if anyone in the audience does have any further questions, please again drop them in chat or Q&A. Yesterday, when we were having a little chat to prepare for today, we also talked a little bit about how the education that people receive not always matches necessarily what is necessary on the work floor. So you see that some of the younger talent maybe that is brought into Bol is not as well prepared as they could be. Could you talk a little bit about this, and in that sense, how could someone who's in this call and is maybe a bit younger or junior kind of compensate for what they haven't learned in school?
Yeah, I think it's kind of what I mentioned earlier as well. It's very much about if you want to work in a company like Bol or an e-commerce company, generally what you need is a way to put stuff to production. So not only train the best possible model, but also make sure that it runs on a regular basis and is stable, outputs the right things, etc. And I think in education, a lot of emphasis placed on creating the best possible model, and a lot less on making sure that stuff actually works in production and delivers value in production. So that, I think, is something that is very, very helpful to keep in mind. And it's also It also sometimes reflects in, you see that I had a lot of junior data scientists in my team that would go, yeah, I like the role, I like the company, but I'm not really doing any data science, which meant they were doing a lot of dragging data from one end to the other end of the company. And so pipelining, they were doing a lot of cleaning because data is never as clean as it was in university. It's always messy and or missing or broken or whatever. So there's a lot of stuff that is part of the entire cycle that probably you don't get that much attention to in education. So I would think actually that it is part of the harsh reality of being a data scientist that actually needs to deliver value. But yeah, the data is never clean. You always spend a lot more time dragging data around the company and making sure that it fits what you want to do to it than you actually do optimizing a particular application. Yeah.
Yeah, it's surely on the job it's not as fun or straightforward as a school project anymore. Now, as a final question, I want to ask you a bit about what your ideas for the future of the field are. So what do you think is one of the most important issues right now in data science, or something we should be paying attention to for the coming 5-10 years?
I feel like a broken record a bit, but I think this making sure that stuff works on production is still the hardest thing that we currently face. So there's a lot of state-of-the-art algorithms or papers being published about ways to do, for example, better recommendations. And when we try to use them at the scale that we currently have, you see that either training the model takes weeks of runtime, or it's just simply not actually delivering value because let me rephrase that. So one of the things that we also see is that when we read, for example, academic papers, you see that there's massive claims being made on how well some prediction works, but when we translate it to the actually putting it on production, it's either very slow, so it doesn't really work in production, or it like better in terms of academic performance doesn't necessarily mean better in terms of business performance. So we also see a big challenge in being able to measure what actually the best possible recommendation is, especially when you combine it with having multiple positions on a particular page. So optimizing for one set is one thing, optimizing for the entire experience is quite a challenge.
Very interesting. So different mismatches maybe between academia and schools and the field, both in terms of skill set and also research. So those were my questions for today, but it was great to hear from you, and it's the first time I have spoken to a data science product manager, so I definitely learned a lot today. Thank you so much again for sharing your experience today. Also, thank you from Reinier, and a shout out to the birds in the background. So thank you. And for those of you joining, in 2 weeks, we will be talking to a data engineer. So if you're curious about the day-to-day of a data engineer, do follow our social media, and you can sign up for the webinar. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thanks for having me.